Joel is my son, Marcy is his wife, the one who smiled as she sold my house behind my back. They told the realtor I'd be out soon, so I bought the house next door and never said a word. Now Joel's in the driveway, red face, screaming like he's the victim, and I'm just standing on my porch, filming the truth they thought they buried. Wait, before we go any further, I got to ask, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments and don't forget to subscribe. The man in the tailored coat smiled at me like I was already gone. I was elbow deep in the hydrangeas when I heard the gate creak open. My gate, the familiar groan of the rusted hinge, turned my spine to ice. I didn't look up at first, just kept snipping dead blooms with my gardening shears. The sound of soft laughter and clipped heels drifting down the stone path toward the front porch. The voices weren't familiar. So much charm, a woman said brightly. Original hardwood throughout. Perfect bones. Then came a man's voice, crisp and smooth like polished granite. And you said the current owner is relocating soon? I stood there. He was mid-40s, tailored charcoal coat, polished shoes that didn't dare touch grass, a leather portfolio under one arm, and that smile wide, confident, presumptive. He looked at me like a polite stranger glancing at a ghost. Then he tipped his head, not quite a nod. Lovely garden. The realtor, bright scarf, clipboard, fake cheer, rushed to cover. Oh, that's Evelyn. Don't mind her. She's just visiting family for now. Visiting? I stepped forward slowly. The shears hung at my side like a forgotten weapon. I live here. The woman's smile faltered. The man glanced between us, sensing something sour beneath the surface. He chuckled lightly, shifting his weight. Apologies. I assumed. I know, I said. You assumed. He had the decency to look sheepish, but the realtor's smile never cracked. Of course, Evelyn's family mentioned the transition is still unfolding. Transition. I stood on my own walkway and felt my name being erased in real time. I was 66, not senile, not sick, not moving. I'd just finished organizing the linen closet. The man offered a hand. I didn't take. They moved inside, past me, into my house. I stood in the garden and felt every hydrangea petal go limp with me. That night, dinner was salmon and spinach with too much lemon and silence that clung like wet wool. Joel kept scrolling on his phone. Marcy poured wine, all smiles and pretense. You were in the garden all afternoon, she said cheerily, passing me the salad. Nice weather, huh? I looked at her fingers, manicured, pale pink polish, no dirt under the nails. The kind of hands that didn't prune or plant, but did sign things. Quietly, easily. Joel didn't look up. Everything good, Mom? Peachy. They didn't even blink. Later, I sat alone on the sun porch, the scent of earth still clinging to my gloves. The house hummed with muffled laughter from the den, their laughter. I stared at the framed photo on the end table, my late husband Harold beside the mailbox we built together the year after Joel was born. Relocating, I whispered aloud, tasting the word like vinegar. I remembered the moment Joel moved back in. Temporarily, they said. Marcy had smiled like it was a favor to me. Until we save up, you know. I cooked for them, folded laundry, paid the water bill, and somewhere in that kindness, they started writing me out. I opened my laptop. The keys clicked in the quiet like a ticking clock. How to purchase property anonymously. The search bar waited a beat, then filled with links. My finger hovered over the trackpad. In the reflection of the dark screen, I saw my face. Quiet, unreadable, underestimated. They'd already started packing for me. They just didn't know I'd begun too. A new tab opened, the real estate listing for the house next door, mine, but now nearly unrecognizable. They thought they had time. I had documents. The kettle screamed behind me, but I didn't move. The PDF glowed cold on the screen. Warranty deed. Monroe residence. Owner, Joel Monroe, 75%. My name, gone. Not misspelled, gone. The kettle shrieked louder. I moved like a ghost, poured chamomile, the steam reminding me I was still real, even if the paperwork said otherwise. Click next tab. More documents, gravestones in digital form. 3 years ago, Joel had asked me to sign a few papers, right after Harold died, when I was groggy from surgery. Joel brought the clipboard. Marcy brought soup. I signed. I forgot. And now I was legally down to zero. At 10:43 p.m., I called Richard Halpern. He answered on the second ring. I need help, I said. By morning, I was in his home office, surrounded by law books and lemon oil. Richard read through the files I'd sent. They played it clean, he finally said. No forgery, just manipulation. The refinance had added Joel to the title. Phased me out. So he owns it? 75%, enough to sell. Enough to remove you. I clutched the tea he'd made. Too much honey. My hands shook. Then, but, he said, and pulled out a yellowed envelope. Harold's postnuptial agreement. I'd forgotten it even existed. It granted me permanent residency rights, unless I chose to leave. So he can't sell if I stay? In theory, Richard said. But if you're not on the deed, things get messy. If he pressures you, a court might not uphold it. Harold's handwriting was still on the margin. Make sure Evelyn never loses her place. Something inside me steeled. He's planning something, I said quietly. Then let's make them unsure, Richard replied. You have more leverage than you think. What do I do next? He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. You can't undo the deed, Evelyn, he said, his eyes meeting mine. Sharp now, like they used to be when he beat Harold in chess. But we can outmaneuver it. He slid a business card across the table, not his own. A real estate contact. Next door just went on the market yesterday, he said. Anonymous trust, clean. Quick, we move faster than they think you can. The teacup rattled gently in its saucer, and I smiled for the first time in days. I could see the house from my kitchen window, and that was the point. The listing photo shimmered on my laptop screen as the coffee maker gurgled behind me. Morning sun slipped through the blinds, striping the oak floor like a barcode. I didn't need to enlarge the pictures. I already knew what the inside looked like. Mirror image of mine, just a decade fresher. The same wraparound porch, the same bay windows, the same creak in the upstairs hallway, probably. But from over here, it wasn't just a house. It was a vantage point. A front row seat to their unraveling. I stood in the yard, my yard, tracing the invisible line between my house and theirs. Years ago, Joel had kicked a soccer ball over that hedge. Harold climbed the fence to retrieve it, came back with the ball and a scraped elbow. Poetic, standing there now. This time, I was the one crossing over, quietly. Richard had already set it up, a dormant LLC tied to a trust. The offer we submitted was clean, above asking. Cash, anonymous. The kind sellers jump at, and families like mine never see coming. Think they'll suspect? I asked. Evey, Richard said, amused. You could host poker night in their attic, and they'd still think you're in Florida. 2 days later, the for sale sign read under contract. At breakfast, Marcy glanced outside. That was fast, she said, buttering a bagel. Wonder who bought it. Maybe a family or some tech kid with a weird diet. Joel shrugged. I stirred my tea. Hopefully someone quiet, she added with a smile. I met her gaze. Let's hope so. I waited until the house emptied out that evening before I made my walk over. The seller's agent had left the key in a lockbox, and I'd already been given the code. The box clicked open like a secret being whispered. Inside, the air smelled faintly of new paint and lemon cleaner. The floors gleamed under the last slants of daylight. It felt sterile, empty, but not cold. I walked room to room, ghosting my hand over fresh countertops and unused banisters. My own house sat just beyond the window. I could see Marcy's yoga mat rolled out in the den. Joel sat on the sofa, phone glowing in his lap. They were comfortable. I uncorked a bottle of boxed wine from my oversized tote and poured it into a dusty coffee mug I found in the cupboard. The taste was bitter, metallic, but warm. I toasted the window. To invisibility, I murmured and drank. Back at home, no one noticed I'd been gone. Marcy was too busy complaining about someone taking her favorite parking spot at the Trader Joe's. Joel didn't lift his eyes from his screen. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about where I'd hang the wind chimes, whether the attic could hold the things they hadn't taken yet. It wasn't the buying that thrilled me. It was the watching. Just after midnight, as I lay in bed watching the street lamp flicker outside the window, my phone buzzed once on the nightstand. A new text from the agent. "Congratulations, Ms. Monroe. It's yours." I didn't reply, but I turned my head slowly and smiled, facing the house across the hedge. I watched the moving van across the street. It wasn't for me. The beeping came first, slow, steady, like a countdown. I stood at the kitchen sink, dishcloth in hand, as the box truck reversed into the neighbor's driveway. Not my driveway. Not yet. From here, I could see everything. Men in blue shirts swinging open the truck's back door, stacks of flattened boxes. A dolly, packing tape snapping shut like distant gunfire. I wasn't supposed to know what it looked like from this side, but now I did, and I was memorizing every second. That afternoon, I came home from a walk to find a gaping space in the upstairs hallway. My dresser, the cherry wood one with the glass knobs, was gone. "Marcy," I called down the stairs. She popped her head around the living room archway, her voice too bright. "Oh, yeah, I had that old thing picked up this morning. We're trying to declutter, remember? It didn't even fit the vibe anymore." I stared at her. The vibe. She waved a hand. "You haven't used it in ages. I thought I'd help. You'll thank me later." I didn't answer. Instead, I walked back upstairs, closed the bedroom door gently, and opened my closet. Inside, Harold's navy pea coat still hung next to my winter scarves. His scent, leather and cloves, still clung to the fabric. They hadn't gotten to that yet. The next morning, I started keeping a list. Not on my phone, too easy to find. A small spiral-bound notebook slipped between the pages of A Tree Grows in Brooklyn in the guest room. Items removed without consent: cherry dresser, ceramic lamp, blue-chipped base, framed embroidery from Aunt B, first edition copy of To Kill a Mockingbird. I added dates, times, circumstances, like evidence, because it was. I also started taking photos, quietly. A drawer left open with items missing. Marcy stuffing throw blankets into a donation bin. Joel carrying a box to the garage. I never stopped smiling, never questioned it aloud. But every image was time-stamped and backed up. Little things changed, too. Grocery lists without my yogurt. A brunch invitation I was accidentally left off. Joel talking to Marcy in whispers after dinner. Once I walked in and they stopped mid-sentence, eyes too wide, smiles too quick. "You okay, Mom?" Joel asked. "Just tired," I'd said. The lie tasted like ash, but it was easier than telling him I was tired of pretending not to notice. Every night while they watched TV or scrolled through their phones, I snuck items out in canvas bags. Heirlooms, keepsakes. The silver cufflinks Harold wore at our wedding, my mother's brooch, the carved wooden nativity set from Vienna. I packed them like I was tucking away pieces of myself. The attic in the new house was dry and clean. I lined the far wall with moving blankets and boxes carefully labeled in code. It felt like building a bunker or preparing for a quiet war. Then one night, as I carefully wrapped my grandfather's pocket watch in a dish towel, I heard footsteps behind me. Joel stood in the doorway, a bowl of cereal in his hand. "You've been quiet lately, Mom," he said, studying me. "Everything okay?" I turned to face him, the towel still cradled in my hands, like something fragile. "Yes," I said. And then I smiled, the kind of smile that holds 1,000 locked doors behind it. I stood in my own living room and strangers complimented my curtains. The front door was already ajar when I returned from the pharmacy, just a sliver, just enough to unsettle. It swayed slightly in the breeze, whispering that something inside had changed. My keys were still in hand, the paper bag of calcium supplements crinkling softly against my side as I stepped over the threshold. The smell hit me before anything else. Overly sweet cinnamon pumped in artificial bursts, masking whatever lived beneath it. The kind of scent they pipe into model homes, designed to suggest comfort while selling off your history room by room. My history. Footsteps moved lightly overhead. Voices unfamiliar floated down the stairwell. Someone was laughing near the kitchen, low, smooth, amused. A woman's voice rang out from the hallway, chipper and professional. The living room gets gorgeous light in the afternoon. The original window treatments are in pristine shape. I stepped forward slowly, letting the front door shut behind me with a soft thud. And then I saw them. A man and a woman, no older than Joel, stood in the middle of my living room, the very space where Harold and I used to slow dance on Sunday mornings. The man had one hand on the mantel, eyes scanning the ceiling like he was already making renovation plans. The woman was pointing to the floral curtains I'd sewn myself the year Joel went off to college. "These are darling," she said. "So vintage. Like something out of a storybook." The words made my jaw tighten. And then, like stepping into a dream with the edges torn, Marcy appeared from the hallway. She wore one of her pearl-button blouses and that stiff realtor smile she hadn't quite earned. When her eyes found mine, they froze. She didn't speak. Not right away. Her lips parted, but nothing came out. Before she could scramble for words, a second woman, polished heels clicking softly against the hardwood, approached me with outstretched hands and the confidence of someone who believed they owned the situation. "Hello, welcome. You must be the neighbor. Feel free to take a look around. We've just started the open house, but we've had strong early interest." I stared at her for a long, silent beat. Then, calmly, "I live here." The smile on her face fractured just slightly. "I'm sorry, what?" "This is my home." Marcy stepped in, like she'd rehearsed it. "Mom, we were going to tell you, we're just exploring options right now, nothing serious. Joel's at work. He was going to talk to you tonight." I let the moment hang between us like damp laundry refusing to dry. The agent took a cautious step back. The couple near the curtains had gone rigid, eyes darting between us. "Exploring options," I repeated, folding my hands in front of me. "Yes," Marcy said, laughing lightly, trying to salvage the scene. "We weren't hiding anything, it's just, you've said before, the house feels too big, too much upkeep. You're always talking about simplifying." "Tell me exactly when I said that." Her face twitched just once, and then she looked away. I took in the sight around me, the two bright accent pillows she'd clearly arranged to hide the sag in the old sofa, the gleaming bowl of fake lemons on the dining table, the fire in the hearth that hadn't been lit all season. Someone's child ran down the stairs with a juice box in hand. "Imagine knocking this wall down," the man near the curtain said quietly to his partner. My lungs tightened, not with panic, but with something colder, something older. I had no intention of knocking anything down. I would leave that to them. Their illusions, their stories, their carefully scripted lies. Marcy leaned toward me. "We can talk later, okay?" "No," I said, turning to the realtor. "It's time everyone left." "Excuse me?" I didn't raise my voice. I didn't have to. "This showing is over." The agent, to her credit, didn't argue. She looked at Marcy, who gave the faintest nod, and within minutes the strangers began drifting out like retreating waves, polite murmuring apologies, glancing at one another with awkward curiosity. The front door opened and shut again and again, until at last it was just the two of us standing there in the quiet wreckage of what used to be mine. "You're making a scene," Marcy said tightly. I didn't answer. I walked past her, up the stairs, past the empty shelf where Harold's war medals used to rest. That night, when the house had fallen silent, I opened the closet and pulled out two black suitcases I hadn't touched in years. They smelled faintly of cedar and old train stations. Travel with purpose. I packed slowly, not what they'd noticed missing, but what mattered, the quilt from our first winter, my journals, wedding ring, a photo of Joel as a child in a Halloween costume he'd forgotten. By midnight, I was ready. I left the bedroom dark, wheeling the suitcases softly downstairs, careful not to wake the sleeping ghosts. Outside, the air was crisp. I crossed the lawn without looking back. At the door of my new house, just across the hedge, I turned the key. The lock clicked. Final. I closed the door and locked it, not out of fear, but because I was home. Inside, I opened every closet, every drawer. Not because I needed anything, but because I needed to know what wasn't there, what had been left behind, what had been taken. In the guest room, surrounded by half-open boxes, I began a list, not of things, but of absences, quiet thefts. Harold's desk, the crystal dish from our wedding registry, Helen's punch bowl. I didn't cry, but my pen pressed hard. One line smeared where I gripped too tight. It wasn't about the bowl, it was about Joel's shrug when I asked. You don't even use it. That wasn't the point. It was about roots, and who bothered to remember them. From my kitchen window, I saw my former porch, hazy in morning light. The hydrangeas swayed like they'd forgotten who planted them. I raised my phone and took photos. Driveway, curtains, open garage. I wasn't documenting them. I was documenting what was mine. In the late afternoon, I walked outside and carried a single object to the edge of my lawn, the rocking chair. It was older than Joel, worn smooth by decades of use. I'd moved it here in the back of Richard's truck, wrapped carefully in a blanket. I placed it facing their house, not to be menacing, but because I wanted something of mine to be looking back at what they had turned into a showroom, a mirror with memory. The next morning, I opened an old metal filing box and pulled out a stack of envelopes. I chose one in cream, thick and formal. Then I took a single sheet of paper and wrote in clean cursive, List of retained personal property. Owner, Evelyn Monroe. Underneath, I detailed a dozen items I had documented claim to, not just emotional ties, but documented ones. Things that had receipts, photos, appraisals, or signatures. The secretary desk alone had been insured when Harold was alive. I folded the paper into thirds and slid it into the envelope. Then I addressed it to myself, only not here. I wrote my name, but under my former address, the home I no longer had the key to. The return address, however, was the new house. I drove to the post office instead of using the blue box by the library. I wanted it certified. I wanted it recorded in a system that couldn't be ignored. The clerk was young and chatty, and I simply smiled, nodding when she asked, Important document? Something like that? As I stepped back into the quiet of my new home, the afternoon sun painted long lines across the hardwood floors. My slippers made no sound. The silence was rich and full, nothing like the emptiness I'd known across the hedge. In the hallway, the wind rustled the blinds just enough to catch my eye. I glanced out across the lawn. Marcy stepped onto the porch, holding the envelope I'd mailed. She turned it over, confused, and I smiled, not with malice, but with clarity. Now, she knew I was still sending things from the past. The cookie tin didn't hold cookies, it held signatures. I wasn't looking for it. I had only gone into the basement of the new house to find Harold's winter coats, still sealed in plastic from our last trip to the dry cleaner. But the moving boxes were mislabeled, and I ended up opening one marked Holiday Decorations 2003 instead. The smell of cinnamon wax and pine garland drifted up like a memory released from a long sleep. Nestled beneath a tangle of string lights and an unused advent calendar was the old red cookie tin. It was metal, faded at the edges, with tiny snowmen circling the lid like sentries. It hadn't held cookies in over 20 years. I had repurposed it in the late 90s for household paperwork. Harold's idea. If the apocalypse comes, he used to joke, we'll have tax returns and gingerbread all in one place. I lifted the lid, fully expecting outdated bills, maybe the yellowed receipt from our second washing machine. But what I found instead made my breath catch. The envelope inside was thick and formal, addressed in Harold's old typewriter font, Evelyn Monroe Living Clause draft copy. I pulled it out carefully, unfolded the pages with hands that had suddenly forgotten how to be steady. The paper was brittle, but the ink was clear. It was the draft Will Harold had drawn up 2 years before his final hospitalization, one I didn't realize we'd ever printed. Clause 9 stood out, underlined in his own pen. I read it twice to be sure I understood what I was seeing. In the event that my spouse, Evelyn Monroe, continues to reside in the family home, no transfer of ownership, sale, or alteration may occur without her written consent. This clause shall survive any refinancing, inheritance, or transfer, unless formally revoked by her in writing. I sat back against the box behind me, the paper trembling slightly in my hands. There had been a final version filed, I remembered, vaguely, but Harold had sworn nothing of importance had changed. Just legal wording, he'd said from his hospital bed, trying to reassure me. Nothing that affects what matters. Apparently, what mattered was still sitting in a cookie tin, not in a courthouse file. By late afternoon, I had scanned the document and emailed it to Richard. I tried not to pace, but my feet had other ideas. The kettle screamed twice, and I didn't bother pouring the water. When the phone finally rang, I answered it before the first full ring had ended. Richard's voice was quiet but sharp. Where did you get this? It was Harold's. I found it in a tin marked for Christmas. Evie, he said slowly, this clause is enforceable if it wasn't removed in the final version. And you say you never signed anything revoking it? This changes the landscape entirely. Joel and Marcy can't proceed with a sale unless you consent. If they push, you could force them into a buyout. Worst case, a judge could freeze the entire transaction. So I have leverage? You do. Serious leverage. This is gold. Quiet, powerful gold. I didn't respond immediately. The relief that washed over me wasn't joy. It was something denser. Vindication, maybe. Or the distant scent of justice preparing to take root. Just as I ended the call, the doorbell rang. I glanced through the peephole and felt the muscles in my shoulders. Not Marcy. She stood on the porch of my new house, smiling tightly, holding something in both hands. A white ceramic casserole dish covered in foil. Her hair was pinned back too neatly, her blouse too crisp for a casual visit. It was the kind of outfit people wore when they came with performance in mind. I didn't move to open the door, not yet. She shifted her weight, forced another smile, and raised the dish higher, like an offering. I brought dinner, she called, her voice chipper and careful. Thought you might be settling in. But what I heard wasn't kindness. It was strategy. When you stop being useful, you start being inconvenient. Marcy's knock was soft, deliberate, 3 polite taps, like she was rehearsing restraint. I didn't move at first. I wanted her to wait. I wanted her to stand there on that porch with her too white smile and the weight of a lukewarm casserole in her arms until her certainty began to peel. When I finally opened the door, I kept the chain latch just wide enough for her to see that I was calm. Calm always unsettles the guilty more than anger. Oh, good, you're home. She tried to peek past the crack into the quiet stillness behind me. I brought dinner. Chicken tetrazzini? I figured you might not have had time to cook with the move and all. I didn't touch the latch. I didn't move. Her smile twitched, but she recovered. Right. Of course, I meant transitioning. I just wanted to say, I think there's been some miscommunication, Evelyn. That was the word she landed on. Miscommunication. Like all of this was an accidental crosswire. Like she hadn't watched me walk into my own home during a show-in and tried to spin it into a happy misunderstanding. Joel and I, we thought we were helping. You've said yourself the upkeep was too much. We were trying to get ahead of things, you know? Just proactively making plans. I unlocked the chain but didn't open the door farther. Plans I wasn't included in. Marcy shifted the dish in her hands. Steam collected beneath the foil, fogging the surface like it was a shame to be seen. We should have talked to you sooner. I see that now. I really do. I said nothing. Silence, I've learned, is not passive. It's a scalpel. It makes people fill space with their own guilt. Marcy looked down at her shoes, then back up. We'd like you to feel welcome, always, your family. The word family hung in the air like a lie caught in a draft. I finally opened the door wide enough to take the casserole, setting it on the side table without a glance. I didn't invite her in. Instead, I stood there, letting the pause stretch so long it became a message of its own. I appreciate the gesture, I said softly. I really do. And then I closed the door. The next morning, my phone rang just after sunrise. Joel's name blinked across the screen. I let it buzz twice before answering, my voice even. Hello? Mom, he said, too casually. Hey, just checking in. Marcy said she stopped by yesterday. I wanted to, loop you in. We've been talking, and we're rethinking the sale. Are you? Yeah, we just think maybe it's not the right time, you know. The market's shifting a bit, rates are weird, plus the buyers weren't as solid as we hoped. I could hear the click of his pen in the background, nervous tick he only did that when he wasn't telling the truth. And you're welcome to come back, of course, he continued. That's still your home. Always. Will be. The shift was so transparent it was almost laughable. The apology wasn't real. It was damage control. They weren't sorry I'd left. They were sorry I'd become unpredictable, unmanageable. My silence had disrupted their narrative, and now they were rewriting it with a tone of graciousness. I looked out the window at my old house. Marcy stood on the porch, her phone to her ear. She didn't know I could see her. Joel cleared his throat. So, we good? I let the moment stretch. I let it tighten like a rope. Then I spoke, quietly, every syllable deliberate. I never left. The silence on his end was loud, stunned. A breath caught mid-lie. I didn't wait for him to respond. I ended the call. Through the window, I watched Marcy lower her phone and glance around the yard. She couldn't see me behind the curtain, but I could see her. And now she was looking for signs. The post-its were small, but their silence was loud. It started with the mirror in the downstairs bathroom, the one Marcy had insisted on replacing 3 months ago. The old one had been slightly warped, the edges dulled by years of steam and scrubbing, but it had belonged to Harold's mother. I'd kept it for the way it caught morning light and made everything look warmer. Marcy replaced it with something sleek, frameless, and cold. I left the first note just behind the faucet, tucked along the edge of the vanity where only a careful glance would catch it. Pale yellow, handwritten in black ink. This wasn't yours to take. It didn't need a signature. It didn't need to scream. Some truths whisper better. Over the course of the next week, I returned little by little. The key still worked, and they weren't home during the hours I chose. Always late morning, when Marcy was at the studio and Joel at the office. I entered like a ghost, deliberate and light-footed, moving from room to room with my purse slung over my shoulder and a stack of notes nestled in its lining. The linen closet. My mother folded these towels. The hallway drawer. Harold's spare keys lived here. Under the lampshade in the reading room. This light once stayed on until Joel came home from prom. They weren't accusations. They were reminders, anchors, evidence. I didn't take anything that was important. I left the space exactly as I found it, save for the inch-square notes, adhesive-backed and ghostly in their message. Sometimes I'd stand still for a moment, just to listen, to remember what silence used to sound like before it was replaced by distant music, new paint, and curated indifference. In Joel's old bedroom, I found his childhood baseball cap, still resting on the top shelf of the closet, right where I'd placed it after he moved back in. He told me once that it was too small now, but he couldn't bear to throw it out. I stared at it for a long while before slipping a note underneath the brim. You remembered when it mattered. The final note wasn't sticky. It wasn't a post-it at all. It was a letter, full page, folded twice. No envelope, no address. I carried it in my coat pocket all the way to the mailbox and slid it in without hesitation. I'd written it by hand the night before, not out of sentiment but necessity. I didn't address it to anyone specifically, but it began plainly. You changed the locks, but not the bones. This house remembers. And it ended with the line I knew would linger the longest. You can sell the walls, but not the history. I sealed it with a piece of red yarn, Marcy's, from the knitting kit she never finished, and let the mailbox click shut. That evening, I made tea and watched the kitchen clock tick past 6. Outside, the street was quiet, still. My old house sat across the hedge, its curtains drawn. A porch light flickered on. I wasn't expecting anything, not that night. I'd done what I came to do. But just as I set my mug down and leaned back into the comfort of my chair, the doorbell rang. 3 sharp chimes, not hesitant, not neighborly. I rose slowly and crossed the hallway, peered through the peephole. Marcy stood there again. No casserole, no smile, just empty hands, and a face that no longer hid behind politeness. This time, she looked ready to say something she couldn't take back. I let them believe I was leaving town. I just didn't say where. When I handed Richard the house key and said I'd be gone for the weekend, he raised an eyebrow. Running away or toward something. Both, I said, and meant it. The retreat was tucked behind tall pines 30 minutes out of town. Willow Ridge, the kind of place with herbal tea on tap and a request to leave your phone at the front desk. I didn't. Said I was expecting medical calls. Half true. You're here for the grief and renewal weekend? The receptionist asked gently. I nodded. No one asked for more. Pain was assumed. My room smelled of eucalyptus and clean sheets. On the nightstand, a journal embossed with, "Healing is not linear." I unpacked just one thing, A framed photo of Harold in his army jacket, not for company, for grounding. I skipped the group meditations and forest walks, spending mornings under wisteria, watching koi in a stone pond. I didn't speak unless spoken to. On the second morning, I took a photo of the garden, koi, mist, golden light, and sent it to Joel. No caption, no explanation. That was the point. Let them wonder where I was, why I hadn't told them, and more importantly, why I hadn't needed to. Let them think Florida, let them relax. I didn't expect the post-it to go viral. Tiffany, their new cleaner, found the note I left under the sink. You cleaned this place, but not its history. She posted it on Instagram with a mocking caption and tagged the location by mistake. Within a day, it spread. Neighborhood forums, real estate groups, speculation. Seller conflict. Matriarch still holds rights. Someone keeps leaving handwritten notes. Richard forwarded me a private thread. Buyers spooked. Monroe Properties a mess. By Sunday evening, I sat in my room with chamomile tea and silence. The phone buzzed. I almost ignored it until I saw the name, Richard Halpern. I answered with one word. Yes? His voice was cool, satisfied. The buyers pulled out this afternoon. I didn't speak at first. I just looked out the window, watched the koi flicker through the pond like fading thoughts. Reason? I asked. Technically, cold feet, Richard said. Unofficially, they don't want to inherit a house that comes with drama or ghosts. I ended the call and slipped the phone under the pillow. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was earned. I leaned back, hands folded in my lap, and stared at the single note I'd brought with me, now taped to the inside of the closet door. Control isn't taken. It's reclaimed. I read it again, slower this time. Outside, the sun dipped below the trees. Back in town, Joel stood frozen on the front steps of the house with his phone pressed to his ear. The agent's voice was firm on the line. They're out. You'll need to disclose everything now, especially the notes. And behind him, another yellow square fluttered against the window glass. They didn't recognize the new car. That was the point. It was pale silver, just understated enough. A used sedan with clean lines. No vanity plate and nothing memorable about it. That's why I picked it. The kind of car that blended into a suburban neighborhood like another blade of grass. No one looked twice when I parked it in my new driveway, parallel to the hedge, engine ticking as it cooled in the late morning sun. Joel was already outside, kneeling in front of the for sale sign. One of its legs had begun to lean, as if even the house was getting tired of standing still. He gripped the post with both hands, adjusting it back to center, muttering to himself. I sipped my coffee from a heavy mug, watching through the windshield. It wasn't the sign he was angry at. The realtor had stopped responding to their texts 2 days ago. That much I'd gleaned from Richard, who heard from someone else who heard from a friend on the zoning board. The house, Joel and Marcy's prize project, was no longer pristine inventory. It was a listing haunted by half-truths, whispered warnings, and one very real clause, with my name still living inside it. I got out of the car without hurry, the gravel crunching beneath my soles as I crossed the driveway. The day was bright, the sun sharp enough to sting. Joel didn't hear me until I was nearly at the edge of his lawn. He straightened up fast when he saw me. There was a pause, that invisible tension before someone chooses their mask. He picked frustration. You know what you're doing, he snapped. Because I honestly don't think you do. I didn't answer. He gestured to the house, to the sign. The buyers pulled out because you couldn't just stay out of it. All you had to do was be quiet. Still, I said nothing. You think the notes were clever? He went on. You think turning this into some twisted scavenger hunt for strangers makes you the victim. I folded my hands in front of me and looked at the porch. The curtains had changed again, beige now, lifeless. Stop acting like this is some kind of game, he said. He was unraveling. His voice had risen without him noticing, his arms jerking as he talked. There was something in his face I hadn't seen since he was 15, lost control dressed as indignation. You lived there your whole life. You should have wanted to leave. You said it was too much. You said it felt empty after Dad died. I finally spoke. That doesn't mean I gave you permission. He opened his mouth to fire back, but I raised my phone and tapped the red circle. Recording. He froze for a moment. Neither of us moved. A cardinal chirped from the power line above, oblivious. Joel's eyes flicked to the phone and then to me, and I saw the calculation begin. What would this look like if she showed someone? If she shared it? If this version of me, red-faced, shouting, gesturing like a man who knew he was cornered, was the one people saw? I didn't have to threaten him. I didn't even need to speak again. I just tapped the stop button, lowered the phone, and turned away. By the time I reached my porch, the sun had shifted, casting long lines across the floorboards. The smell of fresh mulch wafted up from the garden bed. I'd started rebuilding. Lavender and rosemary, plants that knew how to root deep. Inside, I placed the phone on the counter and started making tea. The kettle had just begun to simmer when the notification blinked across my screen. One new email. Subject: urgent property question. No sender listed. Just a single line inside. You may want to check your deed. I stared at the screen for a moment, the kettle whistling louder behind me, then clicked the link beneath the message. My breath caught as the document loaded. Someone had filed a change. But not me. They didn't forge my name, they forged my absence. The signature was mine, but not. Richard pulled up the digital copy on his office monitor, magnifying the line that curved beneath the words. Grantor, Evelyn Monroe. The stroke was perfect. Too perfect. Like someone had traced it with practiced intent. Not sloppily forged with hesitation, but surgically lifted from somewhere else. And then he opened the second window side by side. A scanned image of an old check I'd written to Joel nearly 5 years ago. There it was. The match. They didn't need to fake who you were, Richard said, eyes narrowing. They just needed you to look absent at the right moment. He leaned back in his chair, tapping the pen against his lip. My guess, Joel scanned it, then someone cleaned the file. Not technically illegal unless we prove intent to deceive, but if we show this signature was repurposed without your knowledge on an illegal transfer of property, it's misrepresentation. And fraud, I finished. And fraud adjacent, he added, depending on how a judge sees it. I stared at the monitor, the signature swimming in front of me like something obscene. That check had been for groceries. Joel was going through a rough patch, and I had slipped the money into his hand without asking questions. Now it had come back. Not as a memory, but a weapon. Back at home, I sat at the dining table of my new house and flipped through the thick envelope Richard had prepared. Copies of the original title, the transfer records, annotations with red flags underlined in ink. The weight of the paper alone felt judicial, cold and final. I thought about suing, about dragging the truth into court and laying it bare beneath the fluorescent lights of some beige room downtown. I imagined Marcy trying to explain herself on the stand, Joel fumbling under cross-examination, both of them stripped of control. But then I thought of the house, of Harold's voice still echoing faintly in its woodwork, and the hydrangeas he planted, and the way silence lived differently in old walls. Litigation wouldn't give that back. It would only bury it in paperwork. So I waited. Sometimes power wasn't about striking fast. It was about letting them squirm while you sharpened the knife. I kept watching the house from my side of the hedge. I saw signs of stress bloom like bruises. Marcy's car missing for longer hours. Joel pacing the porch with a phone pressed so tightly to his ear it looked like it might snap. The for sale sign leaned again, slightly crooked, like even it had grown tired of standing up straight for lies. They were unraveling, and not because I'd raised my voice, but because I hadn't. Because the version of me they thought they could mute was no longer playing by their rules. Late Thursday night, I received an email from Richard. No greeting, no pleasantries, just the subject line, zoning board herein, attendance requested, and in the body. Avi, you'll want to be present at the meeting next Thursday. New permit request just filed by Joel. Things are moving. Come prepared. R. I read the email twice, then once more aloud. The sound of my voice oddly steady in the quiet house. He hadn't told me what Joel was asking for, but I could guess. Renovations, perhaps? Another attempt at ownership through demolition? A new title, maybe? Or worse, removal of anything left that still had my fingerprints. I closed my laptop and stared out the window. On the far side of the hedge, the porch light flickered twice, then went out completely. When you speak last, they have no defense. The folding chairs were cold, not just metal on skin cold, but the kind of institutional chill that came from being in a room where decisions were made without empathy, where numbers outweighed stories and names were just lines on permits. I'd arrived early and sat near the back of the town hall meeting room, unassuming, wrapped in a navy shawl and a silence I'd spent weeks weaving. A clipboard passed down the row. Sign in, name if you'd like to speak. I left my box unchecked. Joel didn't see me. He stood near the front, 3 rows up, and facing the zoning board panel, which consisted of 6 men and women in matching business casual uniforms, and one community rep with a sunflower pin on her lapel. Joel's voice was steady as he read his prepared remarks. The lawyer beside him, young, buzzed hair, expensive shoes, flipped through folders with the energy of someone trying to earn their retainer. And the renovation will modernize the original structure without altering the home's historical character. The new layout increases accessibility and energy efficiency while preserving the neighborhood's aesthetic continuity. They wanted to gut the house and rebuild it around their version of the truth. I recognized the blueprint on the screen. It wasn't mine anymore, but the lines had once been Harold's. I remembered him sketching that bay window, measuring with care. Now it was gone, replaced with sliding glass and a sleek patio. The plans blurred, not from sadness, but quiet rage. Joel spoke smoothly. We have letters of support from 4 neighbors. The home, currently vacant, is scheduled for staging pending approval. A rustle in the back. One councilwoman looked up. Anyone for public comment? I raised my hand. Joel froze. Confusion flickered on his face, then dread. I stood and walked to the mic, my footsteps quiet but deliberate. I'm Evelyn Monroe, I said. I lived in that house for 42 years. Heads turned. A murmur rippled through the room. She's her. From my coat pocket, I unfolded a paper. Not their new blueprint, but something older. A copy of Harold's original Clause 9, notarized and never revoked. I retained permanent residency rights. No sale, no major alterations, no transfer without my written consent. Gasps. A few exchanged glances. Joel's lawyer whispered furiously. Joel said nothing, just stared, like he'd seen a ghost reclaim her ground. I finished calm. And for the record, the house was never vacant. Not spiritually, not legally. I never left. Silence, the board whispered among themselves. The vote never happened. As I left, a man in a Red Sox cap held the door. Good on you, he said quietly. That was brave. It was necessary, I replied, and kept walking. Outside, the air was crisp with the beginnings of fall. The town square glowed gold in the early evening light. I pulled my shawl tighter around my shoulders and stepped off the curb like I had stepped into something final. The microphone had captured every word. The meeting had been recorded, and word in a town like this didn't travel. It spread. By the time I got home, my phone was buzzing, a text message from Richard. Realtor pulled out of Joel's deal. The buyer's agent, too, she was watching them, as seen all over the neighborhood group. And beneath that, you've officially become folklore, you know. People are leaving. When the blinds came down, first, they peeled them off one by one, plastic slats clacking against each other like bones in retreat. From my perch by the front window, tea in hand, I watched a man on a step ladder yank them from the den windows with mechanical disinterest. The sun poured through the exposed panes, bright and unfiltered, as if the house itself were flinching from the exposure. Across the lawn, a stack of flattened moving boxes leaned against the porch rail, sagging slightly in the morning humidity. The truck hadn't arrived yet, but the cadence had already shifted. Doors opened with urgency. Conversations once hushed behind glass had turned curt. The kind of voices people use when they're talking through resentment instead of around it. And then came the thud. One box, too heavy or too rushed, hit the porch step hard and burst open, books tumbling across the planks. I didn't have to squint to recognize one of them. The Joy of Cooking, my handwriting still visible on the inside cover, where I'd noted which recipes to skip if Harold was in the room. Marcy was the one dragging that box. She cursed under her breath, crouching quickly to gather the fallen items, her bun unraveling in the late August breeze. I could almost hear her pulse from where I stood. She hadn't looked over yet, but she would. They always did. I took a slow sip of tea, Earl Grey, double steeped, the bitter comfort of something familiar. The kitchen radio played faintly behind me, Sam Cooke humming that change was going to come. Then, as if summoned by my calm, Marcy stood abruptly and turned. Eyes locked, hers narrowed. She stormed across the lawn without warning, her shoes crunching over the hedge path like punctuation marks. I opened the screen door before she could knock. "Are you happy now?" she spat, arms crossed tight against her chest. I tilted my head. "Excuse me. You've made this miserable for all of us." She looked back at the chaos unfolding behind her. "This isn't how it was supposed to go." I studied her creased blouse, sweat along her hairline, mascara just beginning to smudge. She wasn't falling apart, but the seams were pulling, and she hated that I could see it. "I'm not miserable," I said evenly. "In fact, I think I'm finally peaceful." She scoffed, a sharp exhale meant to dismiss. "You think this is justice? You think you won?" "I never played to win," I said. "I just stayed in the game." A beat of silence passed between us, and for the first time I thought she might cry, but she didn't. She just turned without another word, walking back toward the house, where the movers had begun lifting a sofa that didn't quite fit through the doorway. I closed the door behind me and returned to the front window. Outside, the day had grown hot and unforgiving. The movers had begun to sweat through their matching shirts. A bookshelf leaned precariously on the porch steps, and Joel stood in the yard with his phone pressed to his temple, shaking his head at whatever numbers had just entered his life. I reached for the radio and turned the dial slightly. "Ain't that good news?" The room filled with warmth, with brass, with memory, and I let it. It wasn't until mid-afternoon that the unfamiliar sedan pulled up, glossy red, too clean to belong to someone local. A young couple stepped out, woman in a wide-brimmed hat, man in cargo shorts, followed by a little girl in jelly sandals who ran up the driveway as if she'd known it her whole life. A realtor trailed behind them, clipboard in hand. They walked through the open door of my old house. The child paused at the threshold and then turned. She looked across the hedge and waved right at me. They told the agent I'd be out soon. They were half right. The lavender smelled strongest in the morning, when the sunlight was low and the windows were cracked just enough to let the breeze carry it through the room. I trimmed the stems carefully, placing each one into the wide-mouthed glass vase Harold had once used to hold his fountain pens. Now it sat on the windowsill of my kitchen in the house next door. The house I'd filled slowly and deliberately with the parts of me no one else remembered to carry. From this window, I could see it all. The house, across the hedge, now void of Joel and Marcy's possessions, stood like a stage after the curtain dropped. Bare windows, new locks, no more shouting. In its silence, the home had returned to something closer to neutral, not mine anymore. Not theirs either, just a house again. Carol arrived at 10, carrying lemon scones in a floral tin and wearing that same wool shawl I'd always envied, but never admitted to wanting. She was the kind of friend who didn't ask for explanations, only for tea and truth in equal measure. We sat on the porch, two rocking chairs angled slightly toward the road. The breeze was warm with the early touch of September. Birds fussed in the hedges, and the distant hum of a moving truck engine still echoed faintly from down the block. Carol poured the tea. I passed the sugar. For a while, we listened to the clink of spoons and the rustle of tree limbs overhead. Then, finally, she asked, "So," she said, not unkindly, "was it worth it?" I looked at her, then past her, at the house, where Joel once left muddy soccer cleats on the porch, where Marcy baked those undercooked casseroles and left passive-aggressive notes on the fridge where I'd been erased politely and quietly. I let the question settle into the spaces between my ribs. I didn't answer it with words, I just smiled. That afternoon, the new neighbors arrived. For real, not just a showing, not just a walk-through, but keys in hand and smiles wide, with the optimism of people who hadn't lived long enough in one place to resent the walls. They moved in slowly, carefully. The woman, Rhea, I'd later learn, paused at each step like she was checking for a pulse. Her partner Alex carried boxes two at a time, stopping once to admire the hydrangeas in bloom, and the child, the same one who had waved, stood on tiptoe to peek through the mailbox, as if the house might speak back. I baked cookies that evening, real ones, soft-centered chocolate chip, the kind that Harold always said tasted like childhood. I wrapped a dozen in parchment and placed them in a simple tin. No note, no message, just a knock on the door and a smile. When Rhea answered, she blinked. "Are you?" "I'm Evelyn," I said, offering the tin. "I used to live next door." Her shoulders relaxed. "We heard a little about you." I tilted my head. "All true, I'm sure." She laughed. It was a good laugh. Honest. They wouldn't try to own me, that much was already clear. Later that night, I sat back on my porch, lavender scent lingering on my sleeves, the tin kettle whistling softly from inside. My phone buzzed once on the side table. A message, "Joel, can we talk?" "Just us, please." I stared at it, not with anger, not even hurt, just quiet understanding that some things, once broken, aren't meant to be rearranged. I pressed block, then set the phone face down. It turns out, watching someone pack is healing. When they pack the wrong,